Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at ADHD Time on Air. I am joined by Elizabeth and Mike, and they're going to be telling us about their amazing new book that I think you should go buy and listen to or read, whatever way you get information into your brain. I'm going to get the opportunity to talk with them about this book, Flourishing with Adult ADHD, and let them introduce the book themselves because I'm sure they'll do a better job.
Thank you so much. Well, we're delighted to be here and to have a way to share information about our book to people who might be interested.
Yeah, and I'll just share that, Liz and I have been doing research on ADHD and health and wellness coaching together, sometimes with some other colleagues in the field for about 10 years now. And, we started a research institute, springerinstitute.org. And, this book really came about because we were actually working on a research project to develop a set of guidelines for ADHD coaches a 12-session coaching engagement. And this was part of a larger study we did that was recently published in the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine. And through the process of developing the
Yeah,
guidelines,
we worked with a focus group of experienced ADHD coaches. And what really struck us is that the issue of shame being common in many of their adult clients, if not most, with ADHD. It was just pervasive. And the importance of addressing that with clients came up repeatedly as well. So this led us really to the topic of the importance of supporting well-being as an antidote to shame. And we wanted to use our research coach clinician headsets kind of combined together to help therapists, coaches to understand what theories and frameworks could really be useful to promote well-being for adults with ADHD. So really this book evolved from all that.
I love that. So you chose the word flourishing as the title of, and I think it's intentional. So tell me a bit about that choice. Why didn't you use words that we hear so much like productivity and success and management of ADHD?
yeah, that's such an important point. Well, first of all, I'll share that flourishing is a term that's often used in the field of positive psychology, which has a huge wealth amount of research behind it now. And it's really understood as the opposite of languishing. And it refers to what we might call really a sense of optimal human functioning and this kind of holistic state of well being where an individual feels good, functions well, and is able to resiliently adapt to and meet challenges. And this is just so often missing for many adults with ADHD and is really not the typical focus of treatment models. Particularly, I'm a coach and a therapist, but particularly in the clinical world where we're really often focused on correcting deficits. And this idea of flourishing, we think, is a crucially important goal that's often overlooked.
Yeah, and you referred to productivity, success, managing ADHD, and these are all important in their own ways. But they're skill based and they're not based in who the person is. So in coaching, we sometimes refer to the distinction between a focus on the doing, which is productivity, success, even symptom management, and the being or who the person is. And so much of ADHD care, as well as coaching often, focuses on the doing. What can I learn to do better? How can I function better? We know that's important, but we were really shooting for something deeper. In our view, real change, and really what's most important to anyone, is developing agency, self-appreciation, and the ability to live one's own best life. And so that's where we were really headed in that direction with a focus on flourishing.
I appreciate that as a consumer and as an ADHDer. I appreciate that focus. What made you decide to write a book that specially is designed for the professionals, the therapists, the coaches, the people that are helping ADHDers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would just even I know our title specifically calls out therapists and coaches. I would really like to expand that because the fact is the majority of helping professionals come into contact with an adult with ADHD. So nurses, doctors, occupational therapists, physical therapists, nurses, nurse practitioners, physicians assistants, anyone. And we know that, many therapists and specifically even other healthcare professionals are not trained to work with individuals who have ADHD, let alone adults who have ADHD. If anything, you get a little bit of an education. I remember I've
Of
talked with a
childhood.
psychiatrist, right? They got like 3 hours of a lecture on ADHD in childhood and adolescence, right? But so it makes it difficult for individuals with ADHD and adults to find the best type of therapeutic support that's affirming and not pathologizing. So we really wanted to help therapists better understand ADHD in adulthood, the challenges, of course, but most importantly, the ways to work with adults who have ADHD in a more respectful, supportive, encouraging, and affirming way.
I'd also say, Mike, as a therapist and a coach, but I have a background in nursing, but really have spent a lot of time in the coaching realm, focused on ADHD coaching. And even many coaches, including those who are specifically trained to work with individuals having ADHD, we were trained in useful skill sets to support awareness, to support change. And coaches who have ADHD specific training also learn about executive functioning, how motivation and ADHD is different because of the neurobiological differences, and strategies that can be helpful in managing ADHD and executive functioning challenges. But we really wanted to take things a step further for both coaches and therapists, but to show how grounding in theoretical frameworks and in the evidence can really enrich possible ways to work with clients and can support not simply just managing life with ADHD, but really flourishing as a person.
And I'll just add too briefly, we've also been excited by some feedback from adults with ADHD who have found that they actually appreciate this book. And I think you mentioned yourself some appreciation as someone with lived experience. So wonderful for us to hear that we're kind of hitting a wider breadth of readership, even beyond what we were initially targeting.
Yeah, and really getting a finger on something important and meaningful for adults with ADHD, which was really our hope.
Yes, definitely. So if you could like think about the readers, the therapists, the coaches, the doctors, the ADHD professionals in any hat that they're wearing, if they could take like one or two core ideas from this book, what would be your hope that they stays with them? So I know I read a lot of books and not everything sticks in my brain at the end of the reading. So what would you like them to kind of be their takeaway?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
I guess I'll share one and maybe Liz has another thought. My first core takeaway that I hope people to get from reading this book is that ADHD does not exist in a vacuum. It exists within a broader context. That context includes sociocultural, relational, educational, workplace, and our nervous systems, right? So many struggles with ADHD are shaped not only by this kind of neurobiology that we typically think of, but also by this chronic misunderstanding, labeling, stigma, unrealistic expectations, years of chronic masking, and trying to live in contexts and systems that really were not designed for neurodivergent people. And that's one thing Liz and I did in this book was we had a big emphasis, including a whole chapter on sociocultural context and helping providers to understand that. And I think that's something that's very needed in the ADHD space, particularly when it comes to adults.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And if I could add, Micah also sort of focused on taking away a broader understanding of some of the challenges adults with ADHD face. And we definitely looked at all the research on that in our book. But an emphasis I hope people take away also that wellness with ADHD, as it is really for anyone, is highly individualized. There isn't a one size fits all path to productivity, regulation, success, happiness. Effective support for individuals with ADHD goes beyond those productivity systems and planners that you were mentioning earlier. And it really helps people to understand themselves, their unique brain wiring, their strengths, needs, values, and capacities, and to develop self appreciation as well so they can build sustainable lives that work for them and that really support flourishing.
And I'll just add on to that what Liz is saying because, it's a very important misconception that like we could just give productivity systems to adults with ADHD. But the fact is that doing that and assuming that that would work, finding these, cheat codes online and stuff like that actually often leads to more shame in my experience of working with
Failure. Yeah.
clients because you're like, what's wrong with me? Why are these things not working? They're supposed to work with people with ADHD. So that's why we're encouraging a holistic, individualized approach.
I like it. So not only the band-aids, but also addressing the causes and the how to kind of like the behind the wounds. As someone that spends hours reading research, I really appreciate the way your chapters are set up. I like that there's reference. I have a big issue with a lot of these ADHD books that don't give me the sources. So I will give you kudos for that. And I imagine it wasn't easy strategizing, organizing, choosing what to focus, what to include. So tell me a bit about that.
Let me say first that this book did not come together quickly. It was a project that was very meaningful to us and that we did put a great deal of time in.
Yeah, so that's the first disclaimer. This was the biggest. I have ADHD, and this was the most draining executive function capacity project I've ever taken on in my entire life. So I just want to let people know that. But luckily, I was co-author with Liz, who is a Johns Hopkins trained researcher. So, you know, we are not new to the world of research. We are experienced. We've been researching the field of ADHD for about 10 years now, as I mentioned. So we're not strangers to weeding through literature and figuring out, which topics to take from and how to. I mean, Liz can summarize, 10 research studies in, less than half an hour. So we're very familiar in this space.
Yeah, and we also know there is a good deal of reference to the research literature in each chapter, but to manage, we did our research chapter by chapter. So for some topics, there was a good amount of research material to sort through. And for some, there was much less. Like much more has been studied about the problems of living with ADHD than about how to thrive with ADHD. So we also had to sometimes reach outside of the specifically ADHD literature to bridge the gap about how and why certain frameworks or approaches that we felt were very relevant connected to the ADHD space.
It's interesting too, because like, as Liz was saying, there are some topics that were very important that we wanted to make sure to include, but had significantly less peer-reviewed research behind them. So, for example, like there are basically two key researchers who have studied ADHD and mindfulness, and very important topics such as self-compassion have received, less research specifically related to ADHD. So, one study found that lower self-compassion contributes to poor mental health in adults with ADHD compared to adults without ADHD. So
It's an important topic.
Yes.
very important.
I feel I can very much relate. I work a lot with ADHD in retirement, and there is like, let's talk about not finding research. Yes. So I very much can relate to the lack of research and having to go behind to other fields and other specialties. And I did find, I just wanted to put kudos on being able to process all that information and putting it in a way that we can consume it. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And I'm glad to hear that it seems consumable on the other end, because that was really our goal. And we also had some wonderful chapter reviewers who nudged us occasionally to make it more consumable. So
Yes.
wonderful support, and we're glad to hear that it seems to have worked.
So there's a lot of information out there. And as someone with dyslexia, I can't wait to listen to the audiobook version that I understand it should be out. And so I'll purchase that to reinforce the knowledge, because whatever I read with my eyes doesn't totally get into my brain as much as something I read with my ears. But what I did notice when I was reading is that there were some chapters, that really were like, that was a good way to put all this information out there. And one of them was the episode about psychoeducation, which I found the idea of expanding self-awareness and supporting empowerment. Can you explain to the audience what psychoeducation is, and why do you feel it's so important to give it a whole chapter?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say probably psychoeducation is typically historically a more clinical term, coming from the clinical world, but psychoeducation is really the process of helping people to understand about themselves, certain topics, their brains, their nervous systems, the patterns that are impacting their lives. And it's really about making the connection between this thing is happening and this is why it's happening instead of this thing happening and why is this thing happening? What's wrong with me? I don't know why this is why it's happening.
I have executive functioning issues, and
Right.
that's what this is. So, in the context of ADHD, psychoeducation really includes understanding executive functioning, emotional regulation, masking, burnout, shame, and so forth, as a way of understanding what's going on in one's life
Hmm.
in a graspable, more useful way to help self-understanding.
And I'd share that, psychoeducation is what we would say an evidence-based intervention, right? It is a core foundation for being able to take the next steps and figure out, what's going on and how to come up with solutions.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I did when I was reading the book, I did get this failure of familiar of the things being familiar. So you know that like how when you read something and you're like, oh, this sounds like something. So all my training, that's been years since since I've been in in training. It was a nice kind of refresher for some of those terms. And one of the things that I was taught, part of my training is from executive coaching, not people with executive functions, but execs at the business world. And we were trained to use the VIA Institute character strength framework. Like I don't know, it was a strong push for that. And I did appreciate it in the book because I don't always see it in the world of ADHD. And I did appreciate the list of like the examples. So not only having like the framework, but like the examples that are related to the ADHD. So in the book, you present a few tools. I just chose one that, that I connected to as this example. But which ones do you like? Like, what are the ones that you feel connected to? Because a lot of these tools, there's a lot of them in the book. So I was just curious about your personal thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great point. And the way Liz and I approached this book was really saying this is what the research suggests, this is what you can utilize, and let's give clinicians and coaches a range of tools
Toolbox, really.
to
Yeah.
to draw
Hmm.
from, and less so from personal, like, okay, this is what we do with our clients, even though we do incorporate evidence-based approaches. And I really love the VIA as well because it helps people shift away from this deficit narrative towards recognizing strengths and values and being able to just be more mindful and attuned to that. To answer your question, I would say probably my favorite lens to look at things through is this client centered approach because I feel like adults with ADHD are too often boxed into a stereotyped category or stereotyped set of symptoms. And ADHD is incredibly heterogeneous and individualized. So rather than forcing people into these rigid systems or assumptions, I mean, I have clients who will come and, I'll be like, hey, do the VIA character strengths before we have our first session. And, it's too overwhelming for them. Like it's too much for them to do on their own and they can't get it done. And the whole point is that that's no big deal. We can do it together. You can do it later on down the road. And my role is to collaborate with clients and figure out how to build understanding of their nervous system and strengths and challenges and what actually works for their brain wiring.
Yeah, I really agree with that piece about client centered. I came from a nursing background, which is not so client centered, even though a lot of my career I was fighting for patient centered care. But I was just blown away in my first coach training with this total focus on a client centered approach. And so I think that's really key in supporting self determination. I also really personally, especially love appreciative inquiry and helping
Mm.
individuals find where they have had some success and build on that success. Whatever worked there, well, how can that be related to this new thing you want to try? And I love that also when I'm teaching. I really emphasize that with students.
And I guess I'll
Yeah.
just jump back in there briefly because it kind of ties back to the psychoeducation question. And one of my approaches, like, for example, in psychoeducation, we introduced something for motivational interviewing called ask, offer, ask, or elicit, provide, elicit. And is this idea of like, this is how we do client-centered psychoeducation. We ask someone what they know about a topic, what their understanding is.
What
We,
they want to know.
what they want to know. We ask for permission to share a small bite of information. Once we receive that, we share that. And then we ask, how did that land with you? How are you taking that? How does that sit with you? To then kind of complete that circle. So that's a client centered way of delivering
Absolutely.
psychoeducation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Both the explanation and the two examples you provided about your preferences, or at least one of your favorites strategies. Talking about favorites, what was your favorite chapter, or your more meaningful, what you enjoyed the most to because there's a lot of info in that book, and and the other side of that is you could share also what was your hardest chapter to write or least favorite one to work on. So
Yeah.
both
Yeah.
sides are acceptable, even though I tend to like the positive stuff better. But
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. I got to be honest. They're kind of blurring all together for me right now, but I say Liz and I loved working on all the chapters. We were very excited, particularly like two of them that have less research, particularly like we mentioned on adults with ADHD. So we had to more draw from other sources, including at times, reputable blog posts that did focus on this. And that was really those two chapters of cultural humility and sociocultural context that we
Mhm.
think is so important to bring into this space
And overlooked.
and very overlooked. And the chapter on supporting well-being, where we introduce our pillars of adult well-being, and we have some worksheets available there for clinicians to use with their clients. So we,
And I'll just say about that, there's been research, over the past handful of years on all the realms of life that can be adversely affected with ADHD. And we wanted to say, okay, what's going to support people in well-being? We don't have to have those outcomes. How do we support well-being, and what are the areas that we need to tune into? So that chapter was very important for us, kind of shifting the narrative.
and Liz saying all these negative health outcomes, right? That we know, like all the research that keeps coming out about like ADHD, higher, more mortality, higher rates of crime, higher risk, all sorts of things, car accidents, right? But we're hoping to say, okay, it doesn't have to be that way. We can support.
How can you
Yeah.
get somewhere else? Yeah.
Yeah.
What's
Yeah.
meaningful to you, and how can you live a better life?
Yeah. The what's meaningful to you question leads a lot. I work with my clients and I very much related to that. And talking about that, you started our conversation with shame. I want to go back to that because it is so important. And if anyone was listened to previous podcasts, you'd be amazed how much time shame comes up on my conversations with authors about books relating to ADHD. I mean, you might not be surprised, but the listeners might be surprised. So how does shame interfere in flourishing? How does shame interfere in getting us into a better place?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's,
that's very important.
and I'll just share that Liz and I first thought that we would write about shame.
Yeah, we started doing research on that. And it's part of the reason the introduction to our book ended up so long, because we were looking at shame and all these related contexts. And then we just really didn't want to write that book. But we felt it was still an important contextualization of why this book was needed as, kind of opposite. So we left it in the introduction.
And, and I'll say, shame is one of the most significant barriers to flourishing, as you're mentioning, for adults with ADHD, because many of us, I haven't met anyone who hasn't grown up with these internalized messages of lazy, being too much, not enough, stupid, constantly failing despite efforts. And over time, this is just the way, neurology and neuroscience works. Like those experiences start to shape identity and self-worth and impact the way our nervous system functions. So while we don't quite go into this specifically in the book, our book supports what's called a polyvagal theory perspective. And chronic shame keeps the nervous system stuck in this state of threat, shutdown, or even hypervigilance, rather than this ventral vagal sense of safety and connection. So when someone's operating in a survival state, it becomes much harder to access creativity, flexibility, flourishing. Even we lose capacity to access our executive functions when we're in a survival state. So all of those are difficult to access.
Yeah.
I
And
don't know if you remember the first time me and you met face to face. You were standing next to a poster at the ASPAR at a conference, and that's where we met face to face. And I was standing with an author that talks exactly about that book, about that topic, thriving socially with ADHD. And she and you got talking so much that I had to like walk away. I was like, okay, you guys can keep on talking. I'll be back and I'll have you in my podcast later. So if anyone wants to hear her, I think she's like the second or third podcast in my collection talking about exactly that. If you want to learn more about that topic. But yes, I found that an interesting conversation, and I do appreciate the opportunity that we had to meet and talk about this, and that led us to this podcast and to me knowing even about the book coming out.
Flourishing often can begin when people do move away from that self-criticism and the masking towards self-understanding, compassion, and all that leads to nervous system regulation, and seeking environments that support authenticity rather than shame. So really that is what we decided to focus on: what supports well-being, what supports flourishing, rather than shame itself.
And it's not as hard as providers who don't work with adults with ADHD may be wondering, well, how on earth are you supposed to do that? It's not as hard as you might think. Once you start to relabel the challenges as it's a personal moral failing, there's something inherently wrong with me, to there's something different in the way my brain and nervous system are
How
wired.
can I work with that? Yeah.
That's a very simple but powerful shift.
I appreciate that nuance, and I appreciate, and I'm sure my audience will appreciate hearing that shift. And then that really goes to the next question I have here written down. And I write down the questions because, memory and ADHD and executive function challenges. So let's support ourselves by doing those things. So the question I was thinking about is, how do we move our clients from that self-criticism towards the self-understanding without the dismissing the accountability of doing stuff? So how do we shift successfully from self-criticism to self-understanding, but still being accountable for our behavior?
Yeah,
That's a good question.
That's a great question. I often tell clients, particularly who are having challenges, in relationships and marriages with ADHD that has largely gone undiagnosed and untreated. It's ADHD is an explanation, not an excuse. And accountability is certainly very important, but several other things I think are really
Absolutely.
important
Yeah.
too. I would just say, for one, action steps and new behaviors need to be chunked down to very small micro steps.
Yeah. In fact, we have a chapter on that, small wins, because it's so important.
Yeah. And this allows for make it the bar lower, easier for follow through, and providing structures and supports, to enable that. Because without getting any progress forward, we're not going to get any traction. But if the bar's too high,
We'll never get
we
there.
can't jump over that
Yeah.
bar. We're just staring at this endless mountain in front of us. So second, I would say new action steps and behaviors. We like to phrase these as experiments, right? Shifting away from this all or nothing black and white thinking. I've done it or I haven't. I've failed or I've succeeded. Let's look at it from an experiment with a lens of curiosity, and see what we can learn about ourselves during the process and grow with that. And I would say third, experimenting, the goal there is to foster growth mindset.
So key, really. Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're looking at: how to open up our thinking, to be more broad, to problem solve effectively. And that gives more opportunities.
And we have a whole chapter on growth mindset in our book. So we tell you all about how to help clients to foster that. And then, fourthly, I would say accountability shouldn't be about success or failure. It should be about learning and growth and how you can make progress from what happened and move forward.
I appreciate that. I appreciate, and I find that a lot of my clients struggle with the definition of accountability, with even defining what is, they self-criticize even when they do succeed to get to the goal, because they put the raft so high. Like, it has to be a perfect podcast or it shouldn't go out there. It has to be a perfect creation, or so even if they did something, they put it out there and they met their goal, they moved it as they were doing it, or they expected a lot more than they should. And this is where I go to the next kind of question I have about self-compassion. How does that play in the long-term management of ADHD?
Well, there's been increasing research, largely by Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer, just about self-compassion for anyone being important, because for everyone, life is challenging and what we can do is our best, right? So adults with ADHD have typically faced many challenges throughout life, including being judged, being misunderstood, and consequently, like we've talked about, shame and self-judgment. Self-compassion is really an attitude as well as a practice that can, in our view, really provide an antidote to this self-judgment, because it encourages accepting and acknowledging one's experience in a mindful way, connecting with what Kristen Neff calls common humanity. Others have gone through a similar challenge, and it notches down that self-criticism. And it also acknowledges that mistakes will happen. That's part of being human. So it's a gentler response to mistakes or, not succeeding in that little experiment or whatever. And in that gentleness, it clears the way for considering what's next.
Mhm.
And yeah, that's why we think it's very important.
I very much agree with the importance of self-compassion. And when we talk about memory failures a lot, and I keep on reminding people that the default of our memory system is to forget. So we need to be compassionate when we forget stuff instead of that self, because we just fell into the default of the system. So is there any ADHD recommendation that you commonly hear in conferences, online, in social media, that you kind of like go, oh, that's wrong. Let's stop saying that to people with ADHD. Let's stop giving that information because there's really no evidence, or because the evidence is actually the opposite.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I would say much of what's out there online is in the realm of like strategies, self-help strategies for what have worked for other people. You see this on TikTok, Instagram, this and that, that's fine. But if strategies are not built on a base of self-understanding and self-acceptance, just like you were talking about memories, they're not going to stick. They only go so far, and right, they may not be well maintained or built on. So that's why like our book really focuses more holistically. And I'd say also the thing with this is kind of an indirect way of answering your question, but there are many apps out there on the app marketplace, digital tools, that really don't have research to support them, but they're claiming they're backed by research. And I just advise consumers to be wary, and doesn't mean that it won't help you, but many are claiming supported by research, but they're saying we use principles from cognitive behavioral therapy, we use principles from behavior change theory or motivational interviewing, but their actual proprietary program has not been studied. So that's why we really focus more holistically in our book.
And yeah, and from the ground up with the person, really understanding themselves, how they operate, accepting themselves, and then making way for self-determination and growth mindset, which really lead to more lasting change.
I like that. Now that you wrote a book, had all these experiences, what would you tell yourself as a beginning therapist or coach, or like someone that's like you? What would you say if now that you have all this information, if you would go back in time, what would you tell yourself?
For me, if I were to be a new coach again, I would work with clients less on simply an executive functioning focus, skills, productivity, spending a lot of time finding the perfect planner. And that was really the kind of the training I came out of, and really more on, like we talked about earlier, the person rather than the actions, the being rather than the doing, self-understanding, self-acceptance, growth mindset. Really, all of that helps a person figure out the skills that will work for them and be comfortable experimenting. And I think I would just have a total different mindset. I mean, that comes from years of experience as a coach, but also really applying, theory and evidence, also shifted my perspective.
Yeah, I'd say similar to Liz's line of thinking. Yeah, I would bring a more of a psychoeducational emphasis, like I take now, on really brain, neurobiology, nervous system wiring to help clients work more from a somatic lens versus working from a cognitive problem solving strategy lens. So there's more of a holistic lens, and kind of we would say in the somatic field, more of a bottom up lens that I have found is really, in my experience, more conducive to being able to then access cognitive resources.
Appreciate that. And now that you're looking forward, like to the future self, which I know is sometimes hard for us ADHDers, but in general, now that you're looking forward, what kind of professional hope do you continue to like? What do you see in the future?
Think for me, and this you can say whether this is true for you, but well, I think it is true for you. You tell me if it's not. I think our hope for this book and what we put into this book is really not just for ourselves, but we really hope for a couple of things. We really hope to promote evidence based coaching and therapy, better informed therapists, and take the conversation further, not just for ourselves in our own practices, but much more broadly. Take the conversation to well-being. Take the conversation to what theories really support someone from the ground up in becoming the person they would be more comfortable as.
Yeah, exactly. And moving the conversation away from deficit-based models, that medicalized based models, towards more human, nuanced, neuro-affirming and strengths-based perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And our hope is that adults with ADHD can more easily find compassionate support to support their flourishing. Right. I mean, I've heard from countless clients that, providers they've gone to who supposedly knew how to work with adults with ADHD were not helpful and did not, in fact, know how to work with them because they threw some problem solving stuff at them. They gave them a workbook so really helping adults to find supports for meaningful change that happens through connection, safety, regulation, compassion, right? Just helping people to understand how to work with their brains, live in less shame, and permission to live authentically.
I appreciate that. Can you just repeat where they can find you, where they can find the book? What is the full title before we say goodbye?
Sure, thank you.
Our book is Flourishing with Adult ADHD, the evidence-based guide to client well-being for therapists and coaches.
As we've said, people with ADHD themselves are giving us great feedback about the value of this book.
This book is available on Amazon. Hopefully you can include it in your show notes. This book is available directly from our publisher on Routledge. Liz and I both coach at Pathways Ahead, ADHD and Wellbeing Coaching. My clinical work as a therapist in Maryland, DC, and Virginia is at Adult Trauma and ADHD Solutions. And Liz and I both do research and disseminate our research results. We have a digital database available for anyone interested in looking at the research studies out about ADHD coaching at springerinstitute.org. Liz and I are both on LinkedIn and Facebook and whatnot.
And I will put a bunch of those links in the show notes, and I'm sure we'll have other opportunities to talk again, maybe face to face again. And thank you so much for coming and talking about your book. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. We're very grateful.